What is we don't have another marker.
Helps write down on the board.
Oh. No, yeah, right. You see me right.
Blue shows mics are live, so just FYI, if you're playing with pencils and stuff, it'll get picked up pretty easily on those mics, so just be aware of that. Beyond that, have a wonderful session.
Thank you.
All right.
Oh, is that a mic?
Yes.
Oh, but why do we still need that? Those? I'm confused.
No, these are.
Is that because we're live streaming?
Yes. And it's blue because we're streaming
No
right
pressure.
now.
No pressure.
Yes. Thank you. Cool. Up on.
Yeah. All right. So, hi everybody. I'm Kirsha. I'm the assistant, and I passed out some evaluation forms, so I'll collect those from you at the end of this session. We are very happy and lucky to have three guys from AWARE presenting today. We have David Abad, the Men at Work Facilitator and Community Restoration Project member. We have Richard Cole, the Men at Work Facilitator and Men and Boys Engagement Coordinator. And then sitting between them, we have Austin Tagaban, the Equity Coordinator for AWARE. So, yeah.
So,
Can we introduce Lily?
oh yeah, and actually, yeah. So our supervisors here are well. Lily Larson sitting over here. She is manages all of our Men and Boys kind of programming. We report to her and get guidance through Lily. So she also runs all of the shelter services at AWARE. So she's kind of a big deal. But I kind of feel that way about both of these guys too. So my name is Richard, as she said. With David, I facilitate our Men at Work program, which serves a few purposes. One of the things we do is work with men who have committed violent acts. We also have a number of volunteers in the group, which is kind of a new thing, and it's kind of been a new focus for us. The idea that batterers intervention is a great start, and it's not going to make lasting change until we get out ahead of this and work in both worlds, in both intervention and prevention. And I find, for me, it's got these handy Venn diagrams from Austin's last presentation, that because of the ways I identify and the ways I carry privilege, I also find that for me, it helps me do the work. Because when we go through ways in which men exercise privilege, I find I identify with an uncomfortable number of them based on either past behaviors or ways I'm still living. And so I find that these are things that we can do to help everybody. So I'll let Austin introduce himself.
Hi, my name is Austin. My Tlingit name is Nasaiah. I'm Kagwantan from Sitka, and I work at AWARE. I started about 5 months ago.
And I'm David Abad. I am Filipino, and I started with Aware actually initially through advocacy training last year, and then through that has guided me through programs and just other opportunities, which then led me through taking the Men at Work, the 24-week class, and then shifted on to becoming a co-facilitator with Richard. So that is my work with Aware.
And so we've, at different times, the three of us have presented in different ways, kind of men's programming that's offered here in Juneau. And as we were planning for today and looking at kind of past things we've done and realizing, we have 50 minutes, we kind of brought it down to like 2 main points, and then those break down a little further, in how men in a time where we see the Me Too movement be as prevalent as it is, where we've seen Supreme Court justices go through, despite any number of accusations of sexual assault or just misbehavior, we see that these are still super important things, and even men that either consider themselves allies or want to be allies struggle with how they identify in the movement and also what they can do in the movement. And I would say that the three of us experience how we take part in the movement very differently as well. I think, thank goodness, because one of the things that we recognize in working with men is that society has not presented a super healthy way for men to be. Obviously, for women, it hasn't been healthy for women to experience kind of the patriarchal structure that we all live under. But we also know it's not really healthy for most men either. Most men are not defined in a very narrow way. We don't succeed in the same way. We don't express emotion in the same way. And so the expectation that we're going to only feeds into the problem. It feeds into the creation of violence in our lives. It feeds into things like depression. It feeds into things like suicide rates. So we know these aren't healthy things for men. And I think the three of us all express our masculinity in very different ways. And I think that's kind of an important thing for us to work with in the movement and to model. So that's kind of a big thing for us. This is going to shock you guys, but occasionally my perspective is a little, and so men coming from different backgrounds and different experiences mentor me all the time and kind of point out when I'm bumping up against the wall. So I get to work with these guys.
Well, what she said makes me think of, like, I always think about, like, we call it toxic masculinity because it's toxic. It's bad for everyone. It's not healthy for anyone. So yeah, that's what you said. What you just said made me think of, but I think there were other things I thought of, but I don't remember.
No pressure.
No, I had a thought and then it just like slipped my mind. I guess just try to. Well, I think of my privileges and the privileges that I have as a man, and but I also don't. Through this work, I've also recognized that it's slipping again. But I don't know, I feel like I don't have it all figured out. I make mistakes. I try my best every day. It's like this reminder is like, how am I going to go throughout my day to be a better man, to, whatever that means to me. Like, how do I protect the women and children in my life? And I've, a lot of my role models are women, and how do I uplift them and uphold them? So it's these things that I constantly remind myself. And I know that, this will change and this work will change, and I also have to change with it. And with that said, it's just like, I just know that, that I will make mistakes, and I have to be okay with like being accountable. Like when I do, it's like, okay, how do I not make the same mistake? How do I sort of, I guess, take care of myself through that sense.
Yeah.
Something else I've been thinking about a lot as like a gay guy is the amount of like internalized BS that is going on in there. The internalized homophobia and that it like really affects my life a lot because I think like there are a lot of really unhealthy gay men out there, and some of the worst racism I've ever experienced has been from other gay guys who are like, I do not sleep with non-white people, and it's and they like hide behind this idea of preference, right? They're like, I just like white guys, and it's not like it's not like yeah. And so I think about that a lot, especially because like I like want it to be better for younger gay men, right? Like I don't want them to have the same experiences that I've had because they're really, really awful. And so for me, it's about like, like this foundation that we've built masculinity upon in our society is just like totally off base. And it screws all men up, whether or not you're straight. And I think a lot of gay guys think that they get a pass because they're like, I don't even look at women. But that's not the reality. It's like we all have internalized this system which oppresses women and which is violent against women. And so we have to all work on dismantling it.
Yeah, and I think some of the ways, like, we know that a lot of guys struggle with acknowledging their privilege. Hey, I had to work hard for everything I had. I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth. I didn't inherit anything. And we see that with both racial privilege and gender privilege and cisgender privilege. And that some of the resistance is, well, if I acknowledge my biases, it makes me a bad guy. And then the other thing is also like the fear of loss of what you've earned or the privilege you were born with, depending on if you earned it. And these are hard things because men carry shame as well. And it's part of why we speak about toxic masculinity. Like acknowledging your privilege isn't the same thing as being guilty. And acknowledging your biases is not the same thing as being guilty. It's the first step in making better decisions and making informed decisions. I'm feeling a huge amount of pressure right now because I have a few people in this room that I really look up to. Some have just walked in. And the fact is as we work through our biases and as we work through acknowledging them, David mentioned earlier, like we're gonna make mistakes and I make them all the time. And one of the things I've been fortunate about are the people that I work with that are willing to point those out and still love me and respect me and keep lifting me up to do the work. Because I've thought about not doing the work. Like, I'm like, you know what? I can vote and I can try and be nice to my daughter and I can, recognize that other people's voices need to be lifted up. And I can do that as a bystander. And honestly thought that's what I did, for most of my adult life. I was what I thought of as a passive ally. And I got to hear a lecture this summer and somebody talked about allyship. And the fact is that if you're a passive ally, you're not really an ally. It was Lance. Sorry. But I get these lessons all the time from a lot of the people in the work I do. Because I frequently miss when I'm carrying privilege. So it's an important thing for me to recognize. I've gotten to work with Lily and Jesse. I've gotten to work with David and Austin. And I have to challenge myself all the time because I still miss it. Mm-hmm. I like to think I'm really quite woke for a middle-aged white guy. And occasionally I'm maybe not as woke as I like to think I am. I was at an event a year and a half ago, and it was a Juneau Violence Prevention Coalition meeting. And I was presenting something to people that I thought academically was absolutely correct. It was something that was written by a male person of color who happens to be gay as well. And so I'm thinking, I'm presenting this message and I'm right. I'm spot on. And even academically, I still like to think I was right. And I also recognize, like, I'm a middle-aged white dude with a certain amount of privilege, and I'm middle class, and I've not experienced what a lot of the other people in the room. So if I'm presenting about privilege to people of color, there might be something for me to acknowledge in that. and maybe looking for different ways to present it, or asking for help in presenting it, because it's a hard thing, and it's definitely triggering, and I failed. It was not a good experience, and I did not want to come back. Like I was in tears. Like I was like, God, I'm trying to do the right thing, and I fully like hurt people in this room, and that was tough. And I was fortunate because I got to talk to Jesse and Lily about it, and Ati, who's not here. And one of the things that I struggled with was that's part of what means I need to be in the room. Like I'm not ever going to be able to present as other than who I am. But in that role, I can lift the voices of other people. I can listen to Austin and David. I can listen to Colleen and Lance. I can listen to Lily. I can listen to all of you guys, and hopefully be supportive. And that is maybe my role. And what I'm going to model is, oops, Rich tripped up again, and Rich got up again, and Rich kept trying to do it. He kept trying to learn, and he kept trying to listen, and kept getting to work with young leaders like Jesse and Austin and David, who are doing amazing things and inspire me almost every day when they aren't driving me absolutely crazy. And so I'm really fortunate.
So one of the things that I was thinking about while Richard was talking, so I owe a lot to AWARE and the Men at Work program. So when I took it probably this time around, last November, last year. So it's the Men at Work program. It's a 24-week program where it addresses what does it look like for men to be accountable for their actions. And to go through that, I had to sort of introspect on my daily actions. How am I accountable to the women in my lives? How am I accountable to just everything in general? It was every Thursday, and I always put it off, but it was like, hey, Thursday, what did we do in the last week? Or what did I do? But if it wasn't for that, I learned a lot because, as a gay man as well, I thought I was like, okay, my perspective, I've been doing work, I've been doing this, I've been reading. And so I had I was so convinced, I'm trying to do my best, but then this class it just forced me to sort of think in a different way, to really push myself to be like, how are you? What are you doing? And it turned out that I wasn't being very respectful to the women in my life. I wasn't being respectful to my mom, my sister. It was just this crazy sort of oh my gosh, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? And some of these behaviors I was exhibiting, it would still come up because it was things I learned throughout my entire life. I had to consciously undo that every week. And it was hard because it was, when I started to recognize what I was doing and then having to reverse a lot of the things, there was a moment where I had to I had to write these sort of weekly, these check-ins, and I would look at them on my computer, and then who were they about? A lot of them were about my mom. And then it made me think just to sort of dive into that relationship, whoa, why are you doing this? And, it came to a point where whenever I would approach my mom and ask her a question, because of my past behaviors, she would be silent she would think that I was just maybe combative or something. She would just not respond. And then I had to learn how to reverse that. And it's still sometimes I wonder, whenever I ask her a question, if she doesn't respond, is because of the history, that I did. Am I responsible for that? And I had to sort of take accountability. It's yeah, do better work. How do you make meaningful relationships with the women in my life? So it was this sort of awakening, and I owe it to just this program, because before it was just okay, yeah, I'm sort of gliding through society, not acknowledging whatever privileges or whatever things I learned. And then it was, no, completely changed my perspective. So yeah, that's sort of, my experience with the class, and what I continue to do. So like through facilitation, it's just like continuously, still like how do I go about my day? How do I go about my, like, what am I doing? It's like every day. So I see the class as like I'm grateful that it exists, and I'm grateful that I'm facilitating with Richard. And I'm grateful for the work, so.
Yeah, we talk a lot about this at Aware. I think how like it is difficult to do the work, but that's like part of it. Like that there are these moments of friction that happen when you're doing, work around ending violence and around ending racism. But there's like a friction, right, that happens. And that is just part of the work, and that you have to be willing to put yourself in these uncomfortable spaces where you are like, I've never encountered this piece of myself before, or had to examine this piece of myself before in this way. And I think that that's something that I'm really thankful for, having been at Aware, because there were, like these blind spots that I had that I didn't see them because I was blind to them. And sorry. And it's like these wonderful people I work with, like Lily and Richard, who have this lens that is different than the lens that I approach the world with. That is so important, because I can't approach this work just with the lens that I come to it with, because the lens that all the people I work with is massively important, right? The way that they see this work and the way they understand it, and like the friction sometimes when we're trying to do things and it doesn't fit exactly is difficult to get around, but it is also important because we find these places where the work starts happening in a better way because we moved through this difficult space.
So we've kind of addressed some of the things around like why the resistance of men in this work. And we largely work with adult men, but we also try to do as much and would like to do more work with young men in our community. Because as important as it is to do the intervention work and to educate adults, the fact is if we can educate young people, we're going to start seeing where the rubber hits the road, where we're going to start seeing real change happen. And I think it's exhibited here by the fact that, like, when I was growing up in Alaska, the idea that you could get paid to talk about things like this, or to work with men, or to continue to get education around social justice issues, didn't exist at all. It was not. I'm old, so shelters were a relatively new thing in Alaska at the time. The Aware Shelter was founded when I was really quite small. The Safe Shelter in Sitka, which was literally next door to my house. And so the fact that we still have all these struggles, and we're seeing them in the news played out every day. And we walk that fine line because the men we work with, it's changed. My mom has a job. My wife has a job. They all get to vote. The world's better now. And acknowledging that there is some truth to that, and that it's used as a blind. It's used as a way the work is done. The work is only barely just begun. We're looking at generations of work, which can be hard because for a long time, I was on the outside. My wife works at Aware. She's worked there for 13 years. And as a passive ally, I was like, oh yeah, great. This is good. And, but she did the work. She ran the Batterers Intervention Program at the time, which was how they first did a lot of the men's engagement. And, we run into a struggle with guess what? Domestic violence rates are still really high, and sexual assault rates are still obscenely high. And the idea that the work isn't making a difference, and the idea that we aren't seeing change. And the one benefit I had as a passive ally was the thought that as I'm looking in from the outside looking in, I'm seeing that in the years that Lily ran the program, or in the years that my wife Mandy ran the program, that hundreds of men were exposed to ideas that they didn't hear in school, they didn't hear in church, they didn't hear at work, they don't sure as hell don't see on TV. You know, we have pretty clear role models on television of what men and heroes and being successful look like. And it was not what was talked about in this room. And so the idea that they touched hundreds of men with ideas that they never had ever heard before. And I struggled with some of the messaging because I thought I was an ally, but like struggling with the ideas of the various isms, racism, classism, sexism. And I had my first struggle around it was like, well, I mean, I agree with the philosophy behind that, but you're changing definitions of words. There's, Webster's dictionaries. And it took me a while to come around to the idea that like, these things are all tied to institutional power. They're tied to societal power. They're tied to history. And that the reason I could get wrapped up in semantics versus the philosophy was because I could, because that's where my privilege lay. Like, because to me, it was semantics. To me, it was an issue of colonial language versus reality. And we deal with that in class. We have men in class that will argue the semantics around the things we're talking about instead of around the fact that we know people were assaulted in a synagogue just a couple of weeks ago, that we know that the violence rates against trans men and women in our communities is significantly higher than it is for straight white men, for sure. That we know the experience of Native children in our schools is different than it is for my children in our schools. And I can acknowledge that and also see that my kids have been exposed to things that I never saw. They've been exposed to Tlingit language opportunities in school. They've seen culture camps. They have gay friends. And so.
His daughter is awesome, by the way. I spent all weekend with her.
She loves you. She loves Lyle. Lyle was there. She thought he was awesome. So
Look, I want to add it to what Richard was saying. I mean, you think about like if you look at like what has society upholded, and what do we uplift? We uplift white men, straight white men, and then Christian, or just that sort of like these big core American beliefs, or whatever you want to call it. And I think about just like, why do we, why is it so important to hold on to these, these structures, these identities, to uphold them? I can't identify as white, Christian, or what. I just think about like all the sort of, I go back on like, there's male fragility. There's what I think about like the sort of, like anti-Muslim or anti-Jewish like rhetoric. So that goes against these sort of, that goes against Christian values. You have homophobia, which goes against, like the straight values. So it's like, why are we so, like, why do we uphold these structures? Because it's so harmful to maintain, and it's like so much like draining energy to maintain. But yeah, I don't know if you have.
Yeah, we had this really great discussion. I was just at Lead On. It's a youth conference in Anchorage, and we had this really great discussion with the youth. And one of the youth asked this question that I really loved. We were talking about, there's I hope you've all seen it. There's this cartoon. So like there are three people standing on boxes, right? And there's a short person, a medium height person. Do you all know this? Okay. Can I skip the explaining what happens? So they ask the question, who provides the boxes? And I was like, oh my God, that's the best question ever. And so I've been thinking about that a lot. And I don't know who provides the boxes, but it's something that we all do together, I think. That like we all find boxes together. I don't know, does that make sense? And so like part of it is like we have to identify people who have too many boxes together and be like, hey, give us some of your boxes. And that's a part of it, I think, is, like being like, you don't need that box. Why do you need this box? Right? Because some people are standing on this box. It's like white supremacy. That's a box that some people stand on, right? They're benefiting from it, right? And it's a detriment to me, but I'm struggling with my words right now, but there are ways in which all of us collectively together can make sure that box is less merit than other boxes that we can stand on, right?
Well, and it touches on, like, we've heard reflected sometimes the scarcity of resources. Like, if they take away from me to give to them, you steal from the rich to give to the poor, you steal from. Well, one, we have a system that's really quite honestly built upon the rich making money off of the poor. They're stealing from them every day. That's how we have low wages. That's how we have, we maintain a structure that works that way. But it's also how male fragility works. It's how white fragility works. It's how the idea that other people's voices are going to drown mine out, that other people's cultures are going to take away from mine. And we see it exhibited in a lot of ways. I'm Catholic, so you see it in the conversations between Catholic and Protestant. You see it, Christian versus Muslim or Jewish or atheist or, all of these. And we have these limits on faith actually because we've already compromised so many indigenous faiths that have existed all over the world. And so we struggle with somebody else's success takes away from mine. And that's inherent, like, in our system. Like, it's so ingrained in capitalism. It's so ingrained in colonialism, and it's what's been taught. And we do it with immigrants now.
I think part of it too, is this, what was I just going to say? I don't know. Is this fear of that if men lose power, then women will oppress men like men have oppressed women. And that's not, I think, the reality. And that's, I'm so sure that's not the reality. All the women I know are amazing, and I don't think they want to oppress me. I really don't. They just want to be treated like human beings by society, right? And not to have to fear for their safety. And these are privileges that I have as a man. So how did I get this privilege, right? Where did it come from? I didn't ask for women to feel unsafe going home late at night. I do not want that, right? So what can I do as an individual to deconstruct this paradigm of unsafeness for the women I know and love?
And that's really kind of where we get into our last thing is, we've identified the struggle men have in this movement and a lot of different levels. How to identify their own privilege, how to reach out, how to learn about these things. I will be, for as long as I do this work, I'm probably going to be learning more from the men I work with than they are from me. Whether it's the men in prison, whether it's the men in the community, whether it's working with these guys or other men, whether it's getting to hear Colleen and Lyle speak, whether it's getting to hang out with Jesse and debate this stuff. Because of when I grew up, because of how I grew up, I am getting something from this all the time. And these guys are inspiring me all the time. And so trying to find ways in which I have a role in how this happens, because I think, Austin spoke to something that can do with how do we as men make it safer for women? How do we as men start challenging the conversations men have? It doesn't necessarily have to be physical intervention. I saw something bad happening and I rode in on my white horse and I'm the white man who's going to save the world, because that's, as much as I would love for that to be me, it's arrogant and bullshit and super colonial. And so what is my role? And we also know that so much of what men do is based around fear. The men we work with, a lot of the reasons why they don't get involved in intervention, why they don't get involved in these things is because men commit violence against other men too. And so much of how men value themselves is built upon a hierarchical system. Where do I fit in this, and how is it going to be safe for me? And we talk about these things, you know, when we work in the prison, we see it super clearly in the prison. Like, you want to know about what men really don't like and how they value other men, listen to how they insult each other in prison, because everything is gender-based. Like the worst insults men can give other men, whether it be around their sexual identity, if we want to make men feel really small, we use pejorative words that we apply to women. And I think that's part of how we intervene. That's part of how we step in. Like, that's not okay. If you hear guys using terms like that, it's not okay. And that's not an easy thing to do sometimes. Like, you know, you don't want to be the awkward one. You don't want to be embarrassed. Because we worry about how we fit in the hierarchy. So you don't want to be that guy. I want to be safe in this room. I don't want people to laugh at me. I don't want to be ostracized. So I'm not going to be the guy who steps in and says, you know, it's not okay to use that word, or it's not okay to talk about your partner that way, or especially your ex-partner that way, because we see that happen. And it's important to know that, like, because a woman rejected you, it's not the end of the world, and you don't get to call her names or follow her or any of these other things. Like, my pride is not that important. My status is not that important, that it should come ahead of somebody else's. Because when we see violence happen on all its levels, that's really, we've made a choice that what's important to me is more important than what's important to somebody else. And we validate it with lots of reasons. But at the end of the day, that's where the choice came in. What I believe to be true is more important than what they believe to be true. How I want this situation to end is more important than how they do. And I'm willing to use insults. I'm willing to use defamation, and I'm willing to use violence. And if the situation is not going the way I want, I can use any of these tactics just to stop it and take control. And it sounds like, you know, oh yeah, these are extreme things. This is every day. This is, you know, we don't all hit our partners, but we all, I mean, I use sarcasm a lot. I like to think I'm slightly bright, and so I will sometimes talk down to people. I will own the truth is the language we use around men using this behavior in our work. I will be condescending. And there are times with other men, or probably with any number of other people, that I don't even think about because I've so internalized it, where I use my size. I raise my voice. I recognize that at 5'11" and 250 pounds, there are always going to be guys bigger than me, but there is a general rule. I can probably yell or stand close or use my physical presence to have an effect on a situation. And if you want to know, like, men, oh, I lost it. I just lost control. Well, you didn't. You've practiced a behavior for your entire life, so you didn't have to think about it anymore. It's that internalized, but those tactics are tactics you've been using every day. You know what happens when you raise your voice. You know what happens when you stand close. And we know this is true because we also know when men don't use those tactics. They use them with the people they know they'll work on. You snapped with your partner, you snapped with your kid, but you didn't snap with your boss. You didn't snap with your professor. You didn't snap with the police officer. You snapped with your wife or your girlfriend or your sister or your daughter. That's not snapping. You absolutely knew where you were in the hierarchy in that room, and you used a tactic. You just used that tactic so often you didn't have to think to use it.
So as Richard was talking, I was thinking, like, you're talking about your behaviors, and then I was like, okay, well, when I think about it, like, mine was not being able to process emotions in a healthy way. It was like, if things were not going as I said or whatever, and it wasn't happening, my reaction immediately would just be like frustration, or whatever, just like, how do I process this? Like, what? Like, I couldn't communicate healthy. And I mean, now, so that's something I have to practice every day. I guess one of the things that helped me was just, sort of relinquishing all thought, all behaviors, like, what I believe is fact or what I've adopted as like, this has to, like, as men, we always be like, once it's right, like it stays the same, it stays here. But then to know that, like whatever, even if it's fact, there's a possibility for change. One of the things I just thought about, like with mathematics, I remember there was a lecture here and Austin brought it up about like culturally responsive mathematics. And I was like, there's a different way to look at math. And it made me think, because in math, I think of it so concrete. It's like, this is it, but it's like, there's other ways of looking at it. So I've sort of adopted this principle. It's like, everything, whatever I learn, whatever I hold deep and true, that has a potential to change as well. I'm going to hold it until something changes, and it changes with people's stories. It changes with, people's my experiences. So being open to that sort of change and evolution of your own ideas, not holding things concrete, because a lot of it, like what we think is so, we're upholding what we've known for our entire life, I guess. But like a lot of the times when we come to realize, like a lot of it's not that great in the first place. So that is how I've responded to sort of, what I've learned in my experiences and how I sort of, try to model. And, as I said, I'll continue to probably fail, but it's like, being open to that failure and then, creating that sort of place where it's like, okay, I know I'll be fine because I'm going to just keep working harder. And then I also have great women and men as well, just there for support. And being able to rely on that support, being able to just be like open about like being vulnerable was a big thing too. It's like being vulnerable to other men. It was easy for me to be vulnerable to women because I knew that they've done the work their entire lives. They've been upholding men for so long. But it's like, how do I shift that sort of like, how do I not put all my burdens on women? And I'm always, conscious about like, okay, just being aware, maybe sometimes, I can go to women, but it's like, am I putting too much on them? Having that sort of check in my brain and be like, or can I do this myself? Do I need to? So it's like these things, whether they're right or wrong, but it's like, this is the things that I sort of think about like day to day or whenever, like, so it's not easy work because a lot of the times it's just, sometimes I'll just want to rant or whatever and just like, I have this thing, but it's like, finding that sort of balance or whatever it is for myself, but it looks different for everyone. I mean, this is like, I'm not saying this is the solution, but it's like, how I've sort of navigated through, this is pretty much, so the last 3 years, like, I feel like, until I was 25, I was like, thought I had it figured out. And then 3 years ago, went through this sort of change and like more or less this work started. But, so it's been like, how do we reverse 25 years in 3 years and still continue to do so?
And this is kind of, I guess, how we're taught to be as men, but also like, how do we be active? Well, we're going to be active because we're going to make the change. Well, part of what we have to do is actually listen. Mm-hmm. Listen to other people's voices. And you don't even have to agree with them. But listen to hear, not just to argue and get your point out, which is a hard thing. And it's not necessarily what men are taught to do. We're taught a couple of things. You listen so you can respond because I'm right, you're wrong, that's my privilege, and this is how I carry it. Or you fix it. And we see this in how men are taught to communicate with their partners. Their partner comes to them with a problem and they're like, well, here's what you should do, or here's how I experience this. And sometimes that's not what somebody's looking for. They're looking to just be heard.
Well, that I was thinking when you're like listening to be heard, another thing to follow with that is just like, almost have to put yourself a little back further. Is like, are you going to just listen to them in the first place? Because a lot of people, they come at different levels of, awareness, I like to say, or whatever it is. It's just, you may be aware in one, like, like in support of like, I'm for like like immigrant rights or just these things. And then it's like, but then maybe they don't quite understand what does it mean to respect women? So it's like these people come at different levels, and it's like consciously working at these sort of making it better, because I know that there's a lot of issues that I'm not familiar with, but it's just like being aware of like, okay, what can I do work better on, because that'll inform, I guess, like uplifting whatever, like whether it's marginalized communities, and because I'm sure there's a lot of stories that I'm definitely sure I don't know, and then putting myself out there and then trying to, to be that sort of ally.
Well, I think that we're open to any of you asking questions. Jesse?
Thinking about what you just said, like, do you think there's space in like different sectors for this kind of work?
I mean, in my mind, I think it's would be beautiful to see, these programs or some variation of it to be implemented into, whether it's, how do you call them, business or whatever, like in these sort of larger institutions.
Well, and like Austin runs our CRP group, which reaches out to men in other fields and other places and other opportunities. And the other thing is like none of us really started as like, hey, this is what we do. Like I used to work in the business community. I used to run businesses for other people. David's an architect. Austin, we stole Austin right out of college, so I can say Austin's always been a social justice warrior, but he also comes at it from a lot of different angles and takes it out to people in other different angles. And, we see other people doing this work in other places. So I think there are ways in which we can build these roles into other communities. I have a really good friend who does it as a librarian. Friends who do it at the university level, whether it be teaching language, whether it be reaching out to indigenous communities, whether it just be modeling behavior, and all the different ways we model behavior. I think there is lots of ways we can incorporate this in a lot of different roles in the community.
Two things. One, no one can steal Austin. I know it's a facetious comment, but still, no one can steal him. He's his own person. I'm sure he did this willingly. I hope you have. The second one, I was wondering if any of you think there's a difference between toxic masculinity and natural masculinity. One thing I learned from Lance, who's sitting in front from this last thing, is in forms of colonization, they destroy the warrior class who protects the women and children. So I'm wondering if there's a good distinguishing point between the two that we can kind of nuance.
I think that for me as an Indigenous man doing this work, there's a lot of, this is a place of rub for this work, right? So incorporating these sort of, these two different worldviews, right? Because a lot of times in feminism, there's not a place for these traditional gender roles, whereas in Indigenous cultures, there are places for there are gender roles, right? And that doesn't mean that they're like static, right? If there was a woman who was a really great hunter, she was a hunter. So I think that this is something that I think we're still figuring out, that, how to find where these two things meet, right? Because I, for me, those value systems that I've learned as an Indigenous person are very important to me. But also the value systems of, this work are important to me as well. So I'm still figuring that out. It's a great question that we ask ourselves all the time too. So,
the one thing that to put it simply, I think of, when I think of toxic masculinity versus just whatever we want to call masculine, I think of it like, is it rooted in respect? So, obviously I would say toxic masculinity is not. So however you want to identify your sort of, however you want to exhibit masculinity, is it rooted in respect? Is it rooted in protecting, women and children? Is it, but that's how, as Austin was talking, and that's how I was sort of seeing that sort of answer for that question.
Yeah, I think we look at it in a pretty or at least historically from the colonial perspective, we've looked at it in a pretty binary way. You're masculine or you're feminine, which I think we've come to a better understanding of just, first of all, there are virtues that are just virtues and they have nothing to do with gender or sexual identity. We know there are masculinities. There are endless ways to be a man. We are not men in all the same way, and yet there are a lot of commonalities. It's a contradiction, but it's true. Like how you are a man and your virtues are absolutely masculine and are very different than mine. And that's just, I don't think the idea is to stop valuing some of the traditional forms of masculinity, but to recognize and value all the other ways in which men have virtue as well. And I think a lot of different cultures, and very specifically some of the local indigenous cultures, did do that. And that some of our limiting has come from colonial perspective and religious perspective. And in fact, we actually know that historically, even within those communities, if you go back far enough, there was a lot more diverse ways in which to be valued as well. So
I saw a hand up.
Yeah, I was kind of lost when it comes about like in the gay community. So like when it comes to fat shaming and racism within the gay community, how that ties to toxic masculinity, I kind of lost like the connection between like how is that connected to toxic masculinity?
It's toxic. That's how I think. I mean, that's my thought. Sorry for interrupting. Were you?
Yeah. No, I was like wondering if there was like a reason like men just like shame themselves as part of toxic masculinity, and that's why they tend to be like doing preferences because like it's like a shame or like I was just wondering if there's a connection.
Yeah, I think it's all that internalized sort of,
If I want you to finish, and then I have a thought.
Okay. Well, for me, it has a lot to do, I think, with like, there are these systems that have been placed upon all of us, and all of us have internalized them to different sort of levels. And I think that, for a lot of gay men, there's this like mask, is a thing. Like there are societal standards, right, for like what you think of as a gay man, right? Or like, at least within the gay community too, there are like, I don't know how to explain it really. It's just really messed up and toxic. And I think, yeah, it has a lot to do with these systems of oppression that have been placed upon all of us. And that a lot of gay men, whether or not they realize it, have internalized these toxic sort of understandings of how of what sexuality is, of what they are as a man, and so that gets expressed through their sexuality sometimes.
And I mean, I feel like it comes in different forms because as Austin was talking, I was just like, okay, what has been my experience? And I remember the one thing that came up like immediately was, remember the first time I heard it was like, you're gay because you have gay voice. You talk like a girl, like you sound like a girl. And it made me like, I was like, oh man, like I have to go deeper or something? What do I have to like? And it was a time when I wasn't out. So it was just like, it was times when I was just like, okay, I have to appear straight. Well, yeah. So it was like all these different behaviors that, whether it's like things that I would internalize or see, it's like how I look, growing my hair out was a big thing because, I'm sort of, people would be like, why are you growing your hair out? You're like a girl. And I was like, and I mean, I don't know what my answer would be now, but it was definitely made me think, I was like, oh man, can't do that either. But it's all these different messages that I was receiving throughout life. Even with like being, it's like, oh, I'm not into people of color as a gay, or like, you meet someone and then, or if they'd be into me or something, and then they'd be like, are you Latino? And I was like, no, it's like, I'm Asian. And then they're like, oh, and then it's like anti-Asian because I wasn't. So it was all these different, these things that were coinciding and I mean, that's just my experience and it's different for everyone. So it's like,
Or it can even be the reverse, right? They're like super into you because you're a specific ethnicity, right? They're like, oh, you're native. That's so hot. And you're like, why is that like, what?
I feel like that could be a good
Actually,
topic on
Yes, and. Well, I don't have a response, but I have made a parallel, which is, I think when we talk about masculinity, we're also talking about misogyny, and that it's so ever present that sometimes I think a parallel that I see in the Tlingit language community is sort of like, I'm oppressed. How could I possibly be oppressing people? And I think that's probably a similar type of thing, where it actually opens the door for an increase in certain types of behavior. For us, it's silencing our women. I see it, it's a habitual pattern I see within the Tlingit community, where people will say, oh, you're not supposed to talk when there's a clan leader in the room if you're a woman. I'm like, when did we start doing this type of thing, right? And so you could, and also being able to sort of say, okay, well, Tlingit people have been tremendously oppressed, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be examining the ways that we treat each other, whether we're looking at the ways that men treat women, the way that, and looking at these power structures, because we see that a lot, where it's sort of like, oh, I can incorporate this so that I can have power over my small domain. And so those are some things that I like to think about, and also looking at how we address the way that language and vocabulary works in rape culture is something that's really interesting. And I know we're out of time, but sort of one of the things, we were in this room talking about Title IX training and safety, and I said, well, you guys might want to mention that Alaska Native women have the highest likelihood of being victims of sexual crimes. And then we just transitioned into this whole how to not get raped conversation. I was saying, this is not the conversation.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing, is like, what can women do to keep the inevitable from happening? And also the lack of agency. So that this was the first year, I think, where I started just saying to students on the first day of class, don't harass people, don't rape people, don't do these things, because I think also we talk about these incidences of rapes occurring, but we're not sort of saying what percentage of men are raping. And so trying to just sort of be a little bit more active in the vocabulary. I'm really interested in those discussions, and I thank you guys for sharing, giving me a lot to think about too.
Jeez.
Thank you very much for this discussion and for facilitating this and sharing your perspectives. Richard and David, I have these
It's okay.
certificates. Austin,
I wasn't
you
on
have
the
yours from your last presentation. And then
Austin's
we'll
got 3 more
finish.
coming. He's just
I think
celebrity
it's lunchtime.
status.
He needs all 3.
We're gonna go to the back.
I'll take that.
Is it lunch now?
I was the Facebook post you guys shared, experience with color, and the 100 things.
Oh, yeah.
And
Ivan, the kid, whatever, his comment that the kicked dog holler, that was the thing.
yeah. Well, and I kept I'm like, oh, damn it, I'm that ally who always wants to talk about these things and always wants to bend 2 or 3 friends.
Ati Nasaiah, Tagalog?
What is that?
You said you were Filipino, right?
Oh, yeah, Ilocano.
So,
Ilocano too.
Yes, absolutely.
Ilocos Norte, that's your name.
I like how you just assume that. You're
How you
like,
doing?
yeah.
Are you Filipino as well?
I'm just but I never learned to speak Tagalog, so it's like I usually try to talk to other disciples, but yeah, but then if it's other people oh, I'm Tagalog,
Well, the thing that's what a passive ally is actually.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely sort of trying to, because I'm the same way. I grew up not learning my language, and that was a lot of my part.
Oh, I'm the opposite. I grew up here and I went to.
Well, and I think it's kind of like
Born here and I learned English and I still do this time, but you learn Tagalog.
Yeah, so for me, yeah, that's great. Yeah, I totally, well, now
I'm like asking my mom. Well, I grew up to benefit for hearing it.
Right.
Yeah.
But
And-
when I hear it, I can identify.
I'm not-
But I don't know the difference between Ilocano and Tagalog. No, yeah. I know they speak both, so. But then actually it was funny because, well, I'm trying to sort of.
Well, and I think there's so many places
Nasaiah
to
and
Yeah,
break
other
it down.
I
languages,
don't
so I'd
think we
speak
can-
Nasaiah and on my Tagalog friends would be like,
It's everywhere.
I definitely,
I'm asking my mom, like, well, can you do Ilocano? And I was like, oh wait, I know that. I can count to 10. And so that's, I didn't know that was in me. It just came up and I was like, no, I know.
dude, my mom would like,
Yeah.
say like, oh, it's so
And that's what we
weird,
were-
like, oh, that's Spanish. No.
There are men, men have that. I'm so sort of kind of going like, mom, teach me your language first before I even approach Tagalog because I need to learn your
Yeah, I don't know
tongue
anyone that
first.
teach me Tagalog. All my family members are like, you're going to college, you just speak the same. I'm like, no, I want to learn
That's,
Tagalog.
I mean, if you just add it for some of the
I
language,
might.
yeah, just add it to the list.
Well, being
Where I run
being
into a lot,
LGBT,
especially my
yeah.
approach can sometimes
Filipino is
be,
kind of difficult,
somewhere
especially
between
since there's a
furtive and
language barrier there, but also the
and I
whole,
have to try to be cognizant of that, like.
President
Is that
Duterte
gonna
is
get the
scary.
effect I'm looking for?
yeah.
So, yeah, no,
but
absolutely.
also my family's like heavily religious, so they're all my mom's
Are you here all
side,
day?
and they're all borderline abusive, and like, and they're always like, don't do this, maybe go to medical school, it's like.
First it was a little rock, I was just like, oh, what's going on?
Yeah. I should go around and then it was like, whoa.
Yeah. Because we totally planned for something, we planned for like,
But I feel like it was
Yeah.
and then it hit me, it was just like, this is not.
worse, cause my
I went
mom,
over there.
And then,
summer.
I was just like,
Okay.
yeah, my mom's always just.
In it.
Yeah, so I was like, am I gonna recorrect anything? And I was just like, oh, I still.
I've only been there 8
Okay, I get it.
It
I
covered
don't
like
know that
all my
this year.
questions. I was like, but what about this? But what about
And I'm like, mom, I need to get my license for mom, and she's
So
like,
much more we can, I mean, not so much more, but like,
no.
yeah,
you too.
oh yeah, once, well, one win. It's like, yeah, I was like, okay, then, okay, so we can say whatever we want to say.
I saw you resisting something.
Well, it was mostly just like not having the right words. I didn't want to be, you know,
Yeah, but more like yourself.
yeah, well, yeah, I didn't, yeah. Well, it was, yeah, I guess it was mostly like, I don't know how to say this correct.
Recommendation.
Like this issue, like, because I know there's different, like.
Well, you could come to CRB.
When-
That's it's a men's group that we hold monthly. Our meeting this month is on the 9th.
So it's like that sort of.
At Cape, oh, actually,
Are you?
to say this.
Without being,
And you
I
guys,
don't want to be.
We provide.
Being recorded, and yeah, so it was
I'm not
just,
sure what we're doing this month, actually.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I
I
know.
just slipped on like phrasing. It's
It's
because I don't practice.
restoration.
I like when those
Fault.
things kind of come up though, because then it's.
And it's a
And what's going on.
the men's group that we hold
Yeah.
once a month from it's 11 to 12:30. We might revisit this.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, yeah.
11 to 12:30, and we're going to be in the conference room.
and what was the date again?
The 9th, this Friday.
Also needs to get his third, he's 3.
There's lunch provided. Oh, and I have.
Yeah.
Don't print
They
it.
had a friendship.
Probably gonna.
Thank you.
You're gonna get 4.
Good.
Austin, you're gonna shoot for 4?
Shoot 4?
Are you gonna get pulled into another?
Am I? I don't know. Maybe.
So you guys are 3. What room are you guys in? I can look it up. I'll find it.
Yeah.
What time are you going back?
No.
Oh, no.
I'll come back this afternoon.
I could be here all day.
I
Me
had
too.
planned on it, and Billy and Maddie were like,
Richard?
you have work to do. Oh, yeah. I get work. What is work? Yeah, you guys did an awesome job. I'm sure, yeah. Thank you.
I wasn't gonna say it.
I know I was thinking it, so it's like, it's so good of me to be here. Sometimes I just want to pat myself on the back. Exactly. I just like it when I bring my privilege to a location and make it better for everybody. Right?
It's your turn.
Oh, there he is. The power picture. Oh, no, power back on.